Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about women's fashions in the late 14th century. More specifically about how a particular style of headdress allows us to date a great many medieval carvings inside and outside churches. Now you can stand looking up at the carvings on medieval churches and have little idea of when they were carved. Sometimes their location is a clue, so corbels supporting a nave roof are likely to be mid-15th century. But even in the same nave, there could be redundant corbels surviving from an earlier, lower roof. The main part of the building may have distinctive Gothic or Tudor windows, or they may have been replaced in the 19th century with more generic Gothic revival designs. Carvings come with a whole variety of motifs, and more often you might expect, among them there might be a head with a square headdress. Aha, you go. You can say with confidence that the whole set of carvings associated with that one carving are late 14th to early 15th century. Why? Well, let me explain, and then I'll explain why so much decorative stone carving was done at the time they were fashionable. First, a couple of introductory remarks. The carvings you're going to see in this video are all from churches in Leicestershire and Rutland, but my remarks are still valid throughout England, especially along the so-called Jurassic spine from Somerset into Lincolnshire, where easily carved and quite weather-resistant limestone was quarried, and still is. But why Leicestershire and Rutland? Well, in part because I lived in Leicestershire for most of the last 35 years and still live a few miles from the county boundary, so these are the churches I'm most familiar with. And more specifically, in 2009, I helped set up a Project Gargoyle, which recruited volunteers to photograph every figural medieval carving inside and outside all the churches of Leicestershire and Rutland. So, despite the name Project Gargoyle, not just the gargoyles. Figural means anything depicting a human or an animal or something hybrid in between, and medieval masons were very fond of such betwixt and between zoological anomalies. Putting it more simply, the volunteer photographers are just told, if it's got eyes, shoot it. Here's some of the images Neil Forty took at Bottisford. Now there's a corbel table on the exterior with a whole set of simple faces, and they must have been carved as a set. Yet only one has a square headdress. But clearly that's enough to say that the whole set must have been carved at the same time, the same year. The same group or lodge of masons seemingly also worked in the nearby churches of Musson and Harby, and they also included a square headdress. So these too must have been carved between about 1380 and 1410. Why these dates? Well, for reasons I will come to. The late 14th century was a very affluent period for most people in England. And, as you might expect, women were happy to use some of this affluence on the latest fashions. Now, medieval men and women had always covered their hair. Even the most humble peasant wore a simple coif. The more affluent women wanted to show their status by wearing something that did not look in the least like a coif. The range of styles went from decidedly elaborate to almost improbably elaborate. And then, about 1380, square headdresses were on trend. And they stayed on trend for about a generation. Costume historians suggest they would have been less fashionable by about 1410, but no doubt some older women continued to wear them. Now, if you're a stonemason working about 1380, this is something of a gift from heaven. Because before carving a block of stone into something useful, you square it off into a rectangular block. So, having a square headdress at one end of the carving meant that, no further carving was needed on that end. We must assume that masons continued carving this style of headdress while it was fashionable and high status, so until about 1410, and I strongly suspect that at least some of the older masons just carried on anyways, as it was easy to do and presumably still suggested high status. Here we are at Rye with 3 such headdresses mixed in with a wide range of other motifs which make up an incredible corbel table around all the parts of the church. Among these motifs is this chap. He's holding the tools of his trade, which suggests he wanted folks to know he dressed millstones. an incredible difficult task in the days before mechanised grinding, yet an essential one for every miller in the country. I strongly suspect this Dapper chappie was the most senior mason among the group who worked at Rye, and so likely contributed to the corbel table, other than this presumed self-portrait. And although the square headdresses are not to anything like the same standard, so presumably with the work of a more junior colleague or even apprentice, we can assume that this corbel table was put up within a year or two, certainly between 1380s, 1410 or thereabouts. Lionel Wall has put together a convincing case that this group of masons working at Rye were based at Oakham and also worked on many of the churches within a 10 to 12 mile radius of Oakham, going out of Rutland into East Leicestershire and the other direction into adjoining parts of Lincolnshire. Lionel called these masons the Oakham School. I think it would be more accurate to call them the Oakham Lodge. Either way, we're talking about the same group of skilled masons operating in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Their work can be found in places such as Tilton on the Hill. We can see that this unusual piggyback motif of a woman on the back of a man makes a rather dramatic gargoyle. Clearly there's something decidedly misogynic about the intended significance of this motif, so perhaps best not to go there. And although the same masons produced a similar gargoyle for the nearby church of Lowesby, and this might show a square headdress on a face with a beard, but so perhaps we need to add homophobia to their political incorrectness, but actually based on a companion gargoyle at Lowesby Church, then maybe it's not a square headdress at all, but a man's hairstyle. In the south of Leicestershire, at Foxton, a different group of masons working at the same time had, similar ribald temperaments. Here we're looking at a set of carvings which are hood stops on the south aisle windows. One of them is wearing a square headdress, so ought to be a woman, but this woman has a beard, so more likely a caricature or an out-and-out Mickey take of perhaps, a fellow mason. The suggestion that parody is involved is enhanced by another of the hood stops at Foxton, showing a rather asymmetrical face, perhaps someone afflicted with facial paralysis, but also sprouting a pair of large ears. Now, back around 1990, when I first started writing about medieval carvings, I referred to them as hair-like ears. But I was wrong. The person who carved them intended them to be asses' ears, and medieval notions of asses are a pretty close match for modern-day presumptions about the same beasts, and someone, almost certainly a real person known to the mason, is having the mickey taken out of them big time. This triple arrangement at Seiston is, so far as I'm aware, fairly unique, both in having three heads and also for the location on the buttress of the tower. I mentioned that these carvings are also evidence for major changes to the national economy. How so? Well, think about it. Earlier in the 14th century, something rather awful had happened. Between 40 and 60% of the English population had died of the plague. We would later call it the Black Death. The plague reached England in June 1348, and although it had seemingly died out in the 1350s, it returned in 1361, and this time causing the death of around 20% of the population. The drastic decrease in population caused, a shortage of labour, and must have greatly impacted on the training of skilled craftsmen such as stonemasons. The previous economy was based on owing service to a landowner, but this ceased to be effective. There wasn't enough labour to go around. So much as the landowners resisted, the economy moved towards the wage-based system, which of course is the way we still do things. The good thing to come out of this was that, at least initially, the newfangled wage-based economy distributed wealth much more broadly. It didn't last. The landowners got their hands on more and more of it again. However, late 14th century, among many other cultural and artistic endeavours, money was spent repairing churches. Now, as anybody involved with the maintenance of a parish church will be all too aware, they require almost continual upkeep. So the lack of labour and so forth between 1348 and the 1380s would have meant that many churches had now got major problems with roofs and perhaps stonework that needed to be resolved. Furthermore, there was a sense that restoring the church would put the parishioners, shall we say, right with God. Bear in mind, medieval carvings were never simply decorative, but were there for the glory of God. Yes, even the grotesque ones fitted into that mental worldview. Putting lots of carvings on and inside a church would be, well, akin to an insurance policy. In other words, trying to bribe God to keep further visitations of the plague away from their village. It might not be how most folk think it today, but I'll tell you, it was how most folk thought back then. And in addition, there was a distinct sense of keeping up with the Joneses in nearby parishes too. Oh yes. Now, although no medieval contracts with masons have survived from England, comparable contracts on the continent specify that such and such a carving must be as good or better than a similar carving at a specified church, and that church was usually fairly local. So, it seems that itinerant stonemasons and woodcarvers, and they were the same people in the 14th and 15th centuries, had a succession of contracts in fairly close proximity, just as Lionel established for the Oakham Lodge. So, next time you're passing a medieval church, especially one on or near the limestone deposits which make up the Jurassic spine, look out for interesting carvings. If you spot any square headdresses, then you can be fairly sure the carving dates from about 1380 to around 1410, and if you can work out that that carving is part of a set, well, clearly you've dated the set. Just a few words of warning. It's easy to get confused by depictions of hairstyles, as we saw at Lowesby, and sometimes other headgear, even crowns, can be so minimally depicted that at first glance they may look like square headdresses. And they don't have to be medieval. The Gothic revival of the 1830s to the later part of the 19th century created vast numbers of rather generic and romanticised medieval-style heads. However, very few are shown with square headdresses. And when they are, such as here at Thurleston, the whole approach is much more ambitious and three-dimensional than was typical for the late 14th century. If any of this has whetted your appetite for medieval carvings, then follow up some of the links in the description below. My grateful thanks to all the Project Gargoyle volunteers whose work I've included in this video.